Before we begin, imagine a locked box sitting inside a courthouse basement. A plain wooden box. No markings. No ribbon. Just a heavy iron clasp that had not been opened in 83 years. The kind of box people whisper about. The kind of box judges pretend not to notice. The kind of box entire families pray will stay forgotten. Inside that box lay one document that was never meant to see daylight, the last will and testament of Colonel Augustus Fairmont of Charleston, South Carolina. When that box was finally opened, the truth inside it shattered the reputation of one of the most respected families in the Low Country and exposed a secret so dark that the city tried to bury it twice. Colonel Augustus Fairmont was not a name you whispered in Charleston. You spoke it out loud, and you spoke it with pride. He was tall and commanding, a man who walked like someone who believed he owned the ground beneath his feet. He served in the Mexican War, returned with honors, and carried a bullet lodged near his spine. When he stood to speak in the South Carolina Society Hall, whole rooms went quiet. His wife, Margaret Louisa Fairmont, came from one of the oldest Charleston families, the Rutledges. Their marriage united wealth with legacy. Their children were raised in privilege. The Fairmont plantation, known as Riverside, stretched across 1,400 acres of fertile low-country land. Anyone looking from the outside saw a perfect Southern dynasty. They saw the big white house, the oak trees, the Sunday church services, the silk dresses, the polished manners. They did not look past the curtain. They did not look behind the house. They did not look into the lives of the 200 enslaved men, women, and children whose work sustained the beautiful illusion. But even inside that world of strict rules and polite lies, one presence in the Fairmont house stood out. Her name was Celia Rousseau. She was listed in the ledger as property. Purchased in 1843 at an unusually high price. Light-skinned, quiet, observant, educated. No one knew how she learned to read. No one asked. She moved differently than the others. She did not lower her eyes when spoken to. She spoke like someone who understood power. She wore a simple gold locket that she never removed. New visitors sometimes mistook her for a relative. Old Charleston society never asked. They preferred to pretend they did not see. Everyone has secrets, but the Fairmont household lived inside one. In the spring of 1857, the Low Country was suffering a strange drought. The rice fields dried and cracked. The humid air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on it. Rumors spread that the soil itself was angry. Cotton prices began to fall. The newspapers buzzed about conflict between North and South. The country felt like something was about to break. At Riverside, something already had. Margaret Fairmont left the plantation and returned to Charleston with her youngest daughter. She did not return. The eldest daughter stayed in the city as well. Augustus Jr. came back only when business required it. The grand house that once echoed with voices and music fell quiet. Only Augustus and Celia remained at the center of it. People in town whispered. People on the plantation already knew. On March 14, 1857, Colonel Fairmont sent for his attorney, Josiah Prescott. The message was urgent. Prescott arrived 2 days later and found the colonel in his study. His face pale, his voice strained, his hand pressed to his lower back where the old war bullet still rested. A decanter of whiskey sat beside him, and that alone was enough to signal danger. Augustus Fairmont did not drink without reason. Celia sat beside him, not standing, not serving, sitting, in the chair reserved for business associates, her eyes steady, her hands folded. Prescott tried to speak. The colonel cut him off. He said he knew death was near. He said the matter could not wait. He said the will must be written exactly as he dictated. The will began as most wills did. A declaration of sound mind. Revocation of earlier documents. A list of properties and holdings. Then came the moment that would change everything. I give and bequeath to Celia Rousseau her immediate and unconditional freedom upon my death. Prescott froze. Manumission was risky enough, but not unheard of. Then came the real horror. I further give and bequeath to the aforementioned Celia Rousseau Fairmont the entirety of Riverside Plantation. All lands, all buildings, all equipment, all livestock, and all persons currently held in bondage. Riverside, 1,400 acres, 200 lives, given to her. To the woman the law considered property. The colonel's voice did not shake. Prescott's did. He warned him. He argued. He begged him to reconsider. He said the courts would never allow it. He said the family would be ruined. He said Charleston society would burn the will before they honored it. But Augustus Fairmont did not change a single word. He named Celia the sole heir. He named her the executor. He granted Margaret only the legal minimum allowed to a widow and stripped her of any control. He denied his children their inheritance. He did it all clearly and calmly, as if he had been preparing for that moment for years. 3 enslaved witnesses signed the document. Their names were later recorded and erased in the same breath. By the end of that night, the will was complete. 5 days later, Augustus Fairmont was dead. And when the sealed document was read, Charleston society did not gasp. It screamed. To be continued in Part 2. Part 2. The reading of the will. Some stories do not explode with violence or screams. Some stories begin with silence. A silence so deep that it presses against the walls. A silence so heavy that even the air seems to hold its breath. That is the kind of silence that filled the Fairmont family parlor on the morning of May 3, 1857. A silence waiting for a match to fall. A silence waiting to burn. The chairs were arranged in a perfect circle. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, touching the polished wood floor with soft gold light. A silver tray of untouched tea sat near the fireplace. Everything looked orderly, respectable, proper. But the people inside the room were anything but calm. Margaret Louisa Fairmont sat in the largest chair. Black silk, hair pinned tightly, her chin held high. This was a woman who had spent her entire life protecting her family name. She believed she was about to hear a normal will. A will that would confirm her status as widow of one of the most powerful men in Charleston. A will that would secure her future and the future of her children. She did not know that the world she understood was already gone. Her eldest daughter, Catherine, sat to her right. Catherine's hands were folded in her lap. She was quiet, pale, composed. Her whole life had been shaped by society's expectations. Marriage, reputation, appearances. She had failed to secure a husband and the disappointment still sat heavy in every glance her mother gave her. Her son, Augustus Jr., stood near the window. He was 22. He carried his father's posture and his mother's cold watchfulness. He had grown up believing that Riverside plantation and the cotton factoring business would one day belong to him. His inheritance had shaped his identity before he was old enough to speak. The youngest daughter, Meg, shifted nervously beside her mother. She was only 19. She had not yet learned how to hide her emotions. Her eyes flickered with confusion and fear. Other family members sat nearby. Brothers, cousins, business partners, all ready to offer condolences before they returned to their estates and counting rooms. Then there was Josiah Prescott, the attorney who held the will. He stood near the center table. His face was strained. His hands shook faintly as he removed the sealed document from his leather case. He looked like a man walking toward a grave he had dug himself. He cleared his throat once, twice. No one spoke. Everyone waited. Prescott began to read. The opening language was expected. Statements of sound mind, revocation of earlier documents, identification of the estate. A few of the listeners relaxed. This sounded ordinary so far. Routine, proper. But then they reached the first turn. I give and bequeath to Celia Rousseau her immediate freedom upon my death. The room did not move. Not one breath shifted. But something invisible cracked. A thin, quiet crack. Like the first fracture in glass. Margaret's face did not change. Her fingers tightened just once around her handkerchief. Prescott continued. I acknowledge Celia's son, Daniel, born June 12, 1844, as my natural child. I acknowledge Celia's daughter, Ruth, born April 3, 1847, as my natural child. I direct that both be raised as free persons with full access to education and property. A sound rose in the room. Not a gasp, not a cry, something lower, deeper. A sound pulled from the stomach before the throat could control it. Augustus Jr. took one step forward. His face went white with shock. Catherine stared at the floor, unmoving. Meg whispered, "Number." But the will was not finished. I give and bequeath to Celia Rousseau Fairmont the entirety of Riverside Plantation. The land, the house, the working buildings, the livestock, and all persons currently held in bondage. Margaret's hand fell open. The handkerchief dropped to the floor. Celia's name now carried the Fairmont surname. Prescott continued reading because he had no choice. His voice shook. He spoke the words that destroyed everything the family believed was theirs. The Charleston townhouse, the business shares, the investments, control of every asset, all to Celia, none to the lawful heirs except the bare minimum required by state law. It was a complete transfer of power. A complete shift in the balance of society. A legal recognition of a relationship that society had demanded be kept hidden. When Prescott finally finished, the silence returned. But this silence was different from the one at the beginning. The first silence was waiting. This silence was aftermath. Margaret rose, slowly, carefully, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her voice, when it came, was soft and even. You expect us to believe this? You expect us to accept that my husband has left his home and his legacy to a servant? Prescott tried to explain. His words tumbled. The colonel made his wishes clear. The documents are legally binding. The signatures are valid. The witnesses have sworn to his soundness of mind. Margaret's brother stood up. His voice rang sharply. This will is the product of manipulation, coercion, deception. No court will allow this. But another voice spoke. It was Catherine. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but her face was pale and full of something like grief. He loved her. The words fell into the air like stones. Heavy, undeniable. No one looked at Catherine. No one dared. Margaret's composure cracked then. Her breath came in short, sharp pulls. Her hands trembled, but she did not cry. She did not collapse. She did something far colder. She turned to Prescott. We will contest. Immediately. Every line, every word, every signature. We will destroy anyone who supports this. Prescott bowed his head. He knew. The war had begun. Outside the parlor, the bells of St. Philip's began to ring morning service. Their sound rolled across the city, across the harbor, across the quiet streets. Inside the house, the Fairmont family shattered. The world outside did not know it yet. But Charleston would feel the tremors soon. To be continued in Part 3. Title: Working the Fairmont Legacy. Part 3. Engaging Hook. Everyone in Charleston thought they understood the Fairmont family. Wealth, power, tradition. But when the truth came to light, what followed was not just scandal. It was something darker. Something that seemed to wake inside the walls of the Fairmont home. As if the past refused to stay buried. As if the dead still had something left to say. Part 3. The meeting. The morning of May 8 began with heavy clouds rolling in from the coast. The air smelled of salt and rain. Broad Street was crowded, though most pretended they were simply passing by. Everyone knew where the Fairmonts were going. Everyone wanted to see. Prescott's office sat above a printing shop. Old brick, narrow steps, tall windows letting in gray light. Inside, the long table dominated the room. Chairs were arranged in two lines. One for the family everyone had always known. One for the family no one had been supposed to know. Margaret Fairmont sat very straight as if someone had carved her from marble. Her face looked calm but her eyes were cold. Catherine sat beside her, her hands twisting in her lap. Augustus Jr. stared at the door, jaw tight, as if he were preparing for a battle. Margaret's brother James leaned back slightly, ready to strike at the first weakness. Two new lawyers sat beside them, men who knew how to fight with paper and words. When Celia entered, the room fell silent. She did not look afraid. Her dress was plain but clean. Her posture was steady. Her gaze did not lower, not even when dozens of eyes tried to pin her to the floor. Daniel walked beside her. He stood tall for his age. His chin lifted just enough to show he knew what others whispered about him. Ruth held Celia's hand. She looked at the faces across the room with wide, steady eyes. No one spoke at first. It was Margaret who broke the silence. So, you are Celia. Celia inclined her head. Mrs. Fairmont. The two women studied each other. The wife and the woman the husband had chosen. Grief and pride and anger layered between them like thin glass that could crack with one wrong word. Prescott cleared his throat. We are here to discuss the execution of the will. Mrs. Fairmont has requested clarification of the terms. James Rutledge leaned forward. We are here to question the legality of the document. And the moral obscenity of it. Celia did not flinch. The colonel wrote what he believed was just. Catherine made a small choked sound. Augustus Jr. slapped a hand onto the table. Just. You call this justice? You have destroyed our family. Celia looked at him, her voice even. Your father was your family. And he made a choice. The storm clouds deepened outside the windows. A distant rumble of thunder rolled through the street. Margaret spoke again. You expect us to live under your authority. In our home. The home I managed for 20 years. Celia held her gaze. The house will not be changed. You may remain. The will says you shall be cared for. I do not need care from you, Margaret said, her voice low and sharp. At that moment, something happened that none of them expected. The windows shook. At first, it seemed like the wind. But then came another sound. The heavy iron bell from St. Peter's Church down the street began to ring. Not the normal hour bell. A slow, deep toll. Funeral tolls. Everyone in the room fell silent. Prescott frowned. There is no service scheduled today. James muttered. Then why is the bell ringing? No one answered. The bell rang again. A sound deep enough to make the floorboards tremble. Ruth, small and quiet, looked toward the window. She spoke softly. Papa is here. Everyone froze. Catherine gasped. Do not say such things. But the little girl did not look frightened. Only sad. He said he would make it right. Even if it cost him everything. A breeze slipped through the closed windows. Papers fluttered. The curtains lifted. The air turned cold. Very cold. Celia's face went still, as if she recognized something. Margaret's expression changed. Not anger now. Something like dread. Prescott tried to continue. There are legal options to negotiate. It is possible to arrange financial settlements or transfer partial business control if both parties agree. There is no need for hostility. Margaret leaned forward. Her voice was quiet. Celia, what do you want? Celia looked down at her hands. Then at Daniel and Ruth. She spoke slowly, carefully. I want my children to live free. I want them to walk in daylight without fear. I want them to have what was always denied to us. Daniel spoke next. His voice held the same tone Augustus Sr. had once used in his business meetings. We will not give up our rights. We will not return to shadows. Augustus Jr. stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the wooden floor. Then you force this to court. And we will ruin you. We will drag your name through every newspaper. We will make sure no one dares speak it without shame. Celia did not rise. She did not look away. You cannot ruin what was already burned long ago, she said. Your father did that himself. Thunder cracked. The bell sounded again, this time closer, as if the sound had moved from the church tower to the very room. The lights flickered. The air thickened. A faint smell of cotton fields after rain filled the room. The exact scent that had clung to Augustus Fairmont in life. Everyone felt it. Every heart skipped. Every breath shortened. Catherine whispered, tears streaking her face, he is here. Margaret's hand trembled as she closed it into a fist. But her voice did not break. Then let him watch. No one spoke again. Not for a long time. Because at that moment, everyone in the room understood something unspoken. This was not only a legal battle. It was the beginning of a haunting. End of Part 3. Part 4. Engaging Hook. After the meeting in Prescott's office, Charleston whispered that the Fairmont family had been cursed. People claimed the colonel's ghost walked again. Some said justice never sleeps. Some said the dead return when the living refused to listen. And at the Fairmont house on Trad Street, something had begun to move in the walls and the quiet halls. Something that did not sleep. Part 4. Shadows in the house. The Fairmont house stood 3 stories high, pale brick and white columns rising above the garden. It had always looked strong and respectable. But as the news of the will spread, neighbors began to cross the street rather than pass too close to it. The windows looked darker than before. The rooms seemed to hold a weight. And at night, lights flickered in rooms no one entered. Margaret returned home from the meeting in silence. Catherine rode beside her, pale and shaken. Augustus Jr. followed on horseback. James Rutledge walked behind them, his jaw tight and his eyes on the road as if preparing for war. No one spoke on the ride. Not until they entered the grand hall. The house felt colder than usual. The air smelled faintly of tobacco smoke even though no pipe had been lit there in many weeks. The scent was familiar. Very familiar. Catherine froze. First. Mother. That smell. Margaret lifted her chin. Her voice remained firm though her eyes shifted slowly across the room. Your father smoked that blend. It is likely only memory. Nothing more. But the servants had no answer when asked if anyone had been in the study. The windows were locked, the hearth untouched, yet the smoke lingered as if someone had stood there only moments before. That night, candles burned low in the corridors. The house groaned with shifting wood as old buildings do. But something else moved too. Something quiet, something slow, something that did not care to hide. Catherine could not sleep. The meeting replayed in her mind. The children, the look in their eyes, the ringing of the bell, and her father. She could not stop thinking of her father. She rose from bed and walked barefoot down the hall. The lamps flickered. The shadows stretched long and thin. She paused outside her father's study. The door stood open. This was strange. It was always kept shut. She stepped inside. The room was dark. The smell of tobacco hung heavy. The chair behind the desk faced the window. She knew it well. She had watched her father sit in it 100 times. Then the chair moved. Just a small turn. Slow. Soundless. Catherine stopped breathing. The chair turned just enough that she could see the back of a head. Not fully formed. Not flesh. More like a shape. A shadow cut from darkness itself. She whispered, "Papa." The shape did not answer. But she felt something. A wave of sorrow so strong her knees weakened. She stumbled backward out of the room. When she reached her bedroom, she shut the door and locked it. But she did not sleep. Not even when the morning sun rose. The next day, Charleston felt hot and close. The air pressed down like a heavy hand. Margaret held a meeting at the dining table. James and Augustus Jr. sat with her. Catherine remained quiet, eyes down. They discussed strategy, lawyers, inheritance, public image. But no one mentioned the smell of smoke, or the chair that had moved, or the feeling that something unseen listened. James struck his hand on the table. We will contest the will. We will break it. No court will uphold a document witnessed by slaves. No judge will hand over a plantation to a woman like her. Margaret nodded slowly. We must move carefully. The public must see us as wronged. We must speak of betrayal. We must remind them of station, order, decency. Catherine had not spoken yet. When she finally looked up, her voice was thin. Mother, I think father is still here. Both men turned to her. Margaret's expression did not change. But her voice sharpened. Your father is dead. He is gone. Do not speak foolishly. Catherine swallowed. I saw him. In the study. Or something of him. He is unsettled. Augustus Jr. stood. Enough. Grief makes the imagination wild. But Catherine only whispered, You did not see what I saw. That evening, the house seemed to wait. Just after sundown, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring again. Slow, heavy, funeral tolls, one after another. The same toll as the day of the meeting. Augustus Jr. stormed out onto the veranda. He looked toward the church tower and shouted into the street. Stop ringing the bell. We know there is no funeral. We know it should not ring. But by the time he shouted, the bell had already gone silent. The house answered instead. From the upstairs landing came a sound. A slow, steady footstep. Then another. Then another. Catherine clutched Margaret's arm. James drew his pistol. They looked up the staircase. A figure stood there. Not solid. Not warm. But shaped like a man in a long coat. The coat looked like the one the colonel had worn in winter. The figure did not speak. It only watched. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice was calm and cold. The same voice she used to run a household. The same voice that had guided servants, children, guests, and all of Charleston society. Augustus, if you have returned to torment us, then do so openly. Do not hide like smoke in corners. The figure did not move. But the air thickened. The room grew colder. Catherine felt tears slide down her cheeks for a reason she could not explain. Then the figure lifted one hand, slowly, and pointed, not at Margaret, not at Catherine, not at Augustus Jr. It pointed toward the door. The front door. The door that led to the road. To the world. To Celia. Then the figure faded. The hall went silent. The air warmed. The house sank back into stillness. James lowered the pistol with shaking hands. Augustus Jr. spoke first, voice hoarse. He wants us to bring her here. Margaret closed her eyes. No, he wants us to face what he already chose. Catherine whispered, he wants us to finish something. No one slept that night. And at Riverside Plantation, miles away, Celia woke at the same moment the figure faded. She sat up in her bed, breath trembling. She felt something stir in the rafters above. Something patient, something waiting, and she knew, the haunting had only begun. End of Part 4. Would you like me to begin Part 5? Part 5. Engaging hook. After the ghost appeared on the staircase, nothing in the Fairmont house felt safe anymore. Doors opened on their own. Candles flickered without wind, and when the family tried to sleep, they heard footsteps moving in the halls. Yet the haunting was not only inside the house. At Riverside, where Celia and her children lived, something stirred in the fields at night. Something that did not fear the living. Something that remembered. Part 5. The River Road. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray over Charleston. A fog rolled in from the harbor and covered the streets. People moved quietly, as if something heavy pressed on them. Rumors spread faster than horses. The Fairmont house was haunted. Everyone said it. Some swore they had seen a figure in the upstairs window at night. Others claimed to hear crying from behind the walls. The Fairmont family sat at the breakfast table, but no one touched their food. The atmosphere was tight, as if the air itself had weight. Margaret lifted her teacup, but her hand trembled. Catherine watched her mother with worried eyes. Augustus Jr. sat stiff, staring at nothing. James Rutledge looked more tired than angry now. Finally, Catherine spoke. We cannot keep pretending. Father is here, and he wants something from us. Augustus Jr. snapped his head up. I will not speak of spirits. We are dealing with a legal matter. A matter of inheritance. A matter of blood. James shook his head slowly. It is more than that. The house feels wrong. The air is wrong. The walls listen. Margaret set her cup down. She looked at each of them in turn. Her voice was calm but cold. We will go to Riverside. The room fell silent. Catherine stared at her mother. Mother, that is her home. Margaret nodded once. The haunting did not begin until the will was read. This is tied to the truth that was forced into the light. We will speak to Celia. And to the children, face to face. I will not allow whispers and shadows to rule this house. James leaned forward. If we go, it must be with caution. Her supporters may be waiting. People are choosing sides. Augustus Jr. pushed his chair back. Let them choose. Let them speak. We are the Fairmonts. This city knows our name. Margaret paused before responding. Yes, they know our name, but they do not yet know what our name has become. No one had anything more to say. They left that afternoon. The carriage rolled out of Charleston and onto the river road. The landscape shifted from city to open fields and swamps filled with tall grass and cypress trees. Spanish moss hung from every branch like old lace. The river glimmered in the distance, slow and dark. The road was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Catherine watched the trees pass and felt a cold feeling in her chest. The world looked the same, but it did not feel the same. As if something just out of sight watched from behind every tree. At last, the plantation appeared ahead. Riverside, white columns, wide porches, cotton fields stretching beyond it. It looked peaceful, calm, but the calm was strange. Heavy, expectant. Celia stood waiting on the porch. Daniel stood beside her. Ruth held a small cloth doll in her hands. They watched the carriage approach without stepping back. They looked like a family. Not a secret, not a rumor, a family. Margaret stepped down first. Her posture was straight as iron. Celia did not bow. She simply inclined her head once in greeting. Mrs. Fairmont. Margaret returned the gesture. Celia. For a moment, no one else moved. The air felt tight. Catherine felt her heart beating hard. Daniel's gaze met Augustus Jr.'s. The two young men looked at one another for a long time. Both proud, both angry, both unsure what they were now to each other. James spoke first. "We have come to discuss the will. And the events since." Celia nodded. "Then we speak inside." The parlor at Riverside was simple but warm. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains. The scent of lavender hung in the air. Catherine noticed a sewing basket, children's books, a Bible with worn edges. A life lived, not hidden. They sat around a low table. The silence stretched. Finally, Margaret spoke. "My husband has not found peace." Celia's eyes softened, but not with surprise. "I know. The children heard footsteps last night. Ruth said he was in the hallway outside her door." Ruth spoke quietly. "He was sad, not angry." Everyone turned to the little girl. She clutched her doll tighter. He looked like he wanted to speak, but he could not. Catherine's eyes filled. "I saw him in his study. He was not whole, not at rest." Celia nodded. "He is trapped between two homes. Between two lives." Augustus Jr. stiffened. "He belonged to us. To our family." Daniel leaned forward. "He belonged to all of us. You cannot erase what he did. Or who we are." Tension coiled in the room like a drawn bow. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not move. But the room shifted when she spoke. "Whatever my husband intended, it has torn the living in two and disturbed the dead. We must discover what binds him here. Or we will all be destroyed." Silence. Then, slowly, Celia nodded. "There is a place he used to go. Down by the river, under the willow tree. That is where he spoke of things he never said in the house. Things he feared, things he regretted." Catherine whispered, "We go there." Augustus Jr. hesitated. "At sundown." "That is madness." James looked toward the window. The sky was already dimming. "It may be the only time we can reach him." Margaret stood. "Prepare the lanterns." The light faded as they walked down the hill toward the river. The willow tree stood large and bent over the water, its branches trailing like fingers in the current. The surface of the river was still. Too still. Celia held Ruth's hand. Margaret walked ahead without fear. Catherine walked beside Daniel. Augustus Jr. lingered close but separate. James carried a lantern that flickered in the rising night wind. They stopped beneath the great tree. The air grew cold. The shadows deepened. The river stopped moving. Catherine spoke softly. "Father, we are here." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lantern flame bent sideways. The branches above them shivered though no wind touched them. A shape formed near the water. The outline of a man. Not clear, not solid, more like memory given shape. Catherine felt tears rise. Celia's hand tightened on Ruth's. Daniel stepped forward, jaw clenched tight. Margaret spoke. "Augustus, what have you done?" The figure trembled. The river stirred. A whisper moved through the branches. Not words. Not yet. But a warning. The ghost was not alone. Something else was coming. Something older. Something hungry. End of part 5. Shall I continue with part 6? Part 6. Engaging hook. When the ghost appeared at the riverbank, everyone thought they had reached the heart of the haunting. But the Fairmont haunting was not about a restless spirit. It was about something buried in blood and earth. Something older than the plantation. Something that had been waiting for attention. Calling, watching, listening. And now that they had come to the river, it had finally opened its eyes. Part 6. The thing beneath the willow. The shape at the river was faint at first. A shimmer in the dark, like heat rising from summer road. The figure of Augustus Fairmont flickered in and out of sight. His coat, his shoulders, the set of his jaw. His face did not look like the proud portrait that hung in the Charleston house. It looked thinner, tired, afraid. Catherine stepped forward before anyone could stop her. Her voice shook but she made it loud. "Father, we came because you called us." A sound answered, not quite words, more like a sigh dragged across stone. The branches of the willow rustled, even though the night air did not move. Margaret stepped forward next. She refused to show fear. She never had. Her voice was steady. "Augustus, you have torn this family apart. You brought shame to this house. You have left us with ruin. Why can you not rest?" The shape shivered. The river rippled. The lantern James held flickered as if something had passed through it. Celia did not step forward. But her voice reached clear across the space. He cannot rest because you made him choose between love and the law. Between truth and survival. He lived with that choice. And now he dies with it. The shape shifted. The ghost looked more solid now. A face. Eyes. A mouth that tried to form sound. Daniel moved closer. He had not spoken since they arrived. His jaw was tight with a lifetime of anger. Say it. Say what you came back for. Say it to them. The ghost seemed to struggle. The air thickened. Catherine felt a pressure in her ears. The water at the river edge trembled. The branches above their heads swayed without wind. Then the voice came. Not finished. The voice did not sound like it came from the ghost alone. It felt like the entire ground spoke. The river. The trees. The dark around them. 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other, trying to become one. Catherine staggered back. Ruth pressed her face into Celia's dress. Augustus Jr. took one look at the shadow forming behind the ghost and turned pale. James lifted the lantern higher. The light fell across the water. Something was there. Something beneath the surface. Not a shadow. A shape. Long. Dark. Still. Not a body. Not a crocodile. Not anything living. More like a hole in the world. Margaret spoke again, but now there was fear in her voice. Augustus, what did you do? The ghost turned, slowly, as if looking not at them but at the river. The willow branches bent lower, like arms reaching down. Celia closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. A prayer, or maybe not a prayer at all. The ghost spoke again. The words were clearer. Bound, to the land, to the blood, to the children. Margaret understood first. Her face went white. You did not only acknowledge them. You tied the estate to them. You tied the land itself to them. Their blood unlocks the property. Their survival determines ownership. If they die, we regain everything. Everyone froze. Celia pulled Ruth closer. Daniel stepped forward, shoulders squared, glare sharp as a blade. You mean if they kill us, they get it back? Augustus Jr. stared at Daniel across the space. His expression was not confusion. It was calculation. Cold. Quick. Catherine saw it and grabbed his arm. Do not even think it. James whispered something harsh under his breath. Not a plan, but the beginning of one. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Catherine felt something terrible shift behind them. Margaret had known rage before. But this was purpose. Cold purpose. The ghost raised an arm. Pointing. Not at Celia. Not at Margaret. At the willow roots. The earth moved. The ground trembled like something beneath it had rolled over in sleep. Catherine grabbed Daniel's hand without thinking. Their palms were both shaking. Ruth whimpered. Celia knelt in front of her daughter, her hands firm and steady. It is all right. You are safe with me. But Catherine felt something rising. Not a ghost. Not a memory. Something older. Something that had been fed with pain. With secrets. With silence. With the bodies that had been buried beneath this land since before any of them were born. The river whispered again. Price. Margaret's voice rose above it. What price? The willow branches snapped. A surge of cold air rushed across the bank. The lantern went out. Darkness swallowed the group. Catherine could not see her own hands. She could not see Daniel beside her. But she felt something pass between them. Something like a hand brushing her shoulder. But not a human hand. The voice came from everywhere. One life. Catherine heard Margaret inhale sharply. Whose life? Silence. Then the ghost of Augustus Fairmont turned his head. Slowly. Toward the house. Toward the legacy. Toward the bloodline. The voice answered. Firstborn. Catherine's heart stopped. Every face turned to Catherine. Not the eldest child. The firstborn daughter. The child Margaret had before her marriage. The daughter buried at St. Philip's before her first birthday. The one no one spoke of. A name that had never been written in any family Bible. Margaret's secret. The price had already been paid. The ground opened. The water rose. And something crawled out. End of part 6. Shall I continue with part 7? Part 7. Hook. Some secrets are not buried. Some wait in the dark, patient as breathing shadows. And when the truth finally rises, it does not come quietly. It comes hungry. The night had settled heavy over the old estate. The trees outside moved like tall black figures whispering among themselves. A cold wind slid through every crack in the walls. It felt as if the house itself was breathing. Catherine sat alone in her small room with only a candle beside her. The flame shook as if frightened. She had not slept since the discovery in the cellar. Her hands still remembered the feel of the damp stones. Her ears still heard the strange low humming below the floor. And her heart still held the image burned inside it. The room of prayer was not a room of prayer at all. It was a room of sacrifice. Catherine had tried to speak to the Reverend Mother earlier that day. She expected concern or shock or even denial. Instead she received silence. The Reverend Mother had stared at her with calm eyes. She placed a hand gently on Catherine's shoulder and told her to rest. There was no anger, no explanation, only an eerie softness that frightened Catherine more than any shout could. Since then, Catherine felt watched. Not only by the sisters. By something else. Something that moved unseen through the halls. She heard footsteps at night, slow and measured. She heard whispers behind doors that should have been empty. She saw shapes move in corners, always disappearing the moment she tried to focus. But the fear was not enough to stop her. She needed answers. She waited until the candle burned low and the halls fell quiet. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The floor felt colder than usual. Her footsteps echoed as if the walls were listening. She reached the staircase that led down to the main hall. But instead of going down, she moved toward the back of the building. Toward the library. That was where the older records were kept. Records that the Reverend Mother never allowed anyone to read. The door opened with a soft creak. The library smelled of old paper and dust. Moonlight slipped through the tall windows and stretched across the floor like pale ribbons. Catherine moved between the shelves, her fingers shaking as she traced the edges of the wooden cases. She stopped at a small locked cabinet. She had seen the Reverend Mother open it once with a small brass key. Catherine reached into her pocket. She had taken the key earlier when the Reverend Mother believed she was praying. The lock clicked. Inside were leather-bound books. Some were written in English, some in Latin, and some in a language Catherine could not recognize. She took the oldest one. The leather was worn and cracked. When she opened it, a small dried flower fell to the floor. Its petals were black. The pages told a story. Not of holy devotion, but of old rites. Rites older than the church itself. The sisters who once lived here had not come to serve God. They came to serve something ancient. Something that promised protection and power. Something that demanded loyalty and silence and blood. The ritual room Catherine had found in the cellar was part of that tradition. Catherine felt her breath grow tight. She saw drawings of the marked circle on the floor. She saw symbols that matched the ones carved into the stone. But the worst part was when she found a list of names. The handwriting changed over the years. But the pattern did not. Every generation, a new girl was chosen. A girl who was quiet. A girl who was obedient. A girl who would not be questioned if she disappeared. Her name was written at the bottom. Catherine pulled back so hard the chair tipped and hit the floor. The sound echoed. She froze. The library suddenly felt too silent. She closed the book and stepped back. That was when she saw movement in the reflection of the window. Someone was standing behind her. She turned slowly. It was Sister Miriam. Sister Miriam's face looked pale and exhausted. Her eyes held a shadow that did not belong to any normal expression. She stepped closer. "You should not be here," Sister Miriam said softly. "It is almost time." Catherine backed away. Time for what she could barely speak. "For your offering. For your place among us." Sister Miriam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Catherine ran. Her footsteps thundered across the hall. She did not dare look back. She could hear Sister Miriam walking, not running, as if she already knew where Catherine would end up. Catherine rushed toward the main doors. She grabbed the handle. It did not move. She pulled again. The door was locked. She turned to the windows, but they had been barred long ago. She was trapped. A soft voice spoke behind her. It was the Reverend Mother. She walked forward slowly, her hands held together in front of her, her expression calm and almost gentle. "You were chosen because you are pure," she said. "Your heart is strong. Your faith is real. The others before you forgot themselves. But you, Catherine, you will complete the circle. The house has waited for you." Catherine felt tears blur her vision. She stepped back, but her back touched the cold wood of the locked door. The Reverend Mother lifted one hand and touched Catherine's cheek. Her skin felt cold, like stone left in the night. "Do not be afraid. The old ones watch over us. They protect this place. They give us life beyond death." Catherine pushed her hand away. She stared at the Reverend Mother with new clarity. This was not devotion. This was madness. Catherine drew in a shaking breath and whispered, "I will not be one of you." The Reverend Mother's expression did not change. She simply nodded once. Then she stepped back. "Very well," she said. The lights in the hallway flickered. The building groaned. The shadows along the walls moved as if alive. The air became heavy and thick, like something unseen had just entered the room. The Reverend Mother spoke again, her voice distant and echoing. "Then you will be the first to run." Catherine did not understand until she heard it. Something moving below the floor. Something waking. Something hungry. The doors behind her shook, not from her hands, but as if something on the other side wanted to come in. Catherine knew then. This was not a house of God. This was a house of the forgotten. And she was not safe. Not anymore. If you want, I can now write part 8. Here's part 8 of your historic horror story, modified to be engaging, written for an American YouTube audience, about 1,000 words, in simple and easy English. The tension in Charleston had reached a fever pitch by the time the court proceedings began. Word of Colonel Augustus Fairmont's will had spread through every circle of society, and curiosity had drawn people from all over the city to watch what promised to be a scandal unlike any in living memory. The courthouse steps were crowded with spectators, reporters, and lawyers, all eager to witness the confrontation between long-held tradition and a radical challenge to the established order. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint trace of ink from stacks of legal documents. Margaret Fairmont sat rigidly, her posture perfect, as if she could hold herself above the chaos with sheer willpower. Beside her, her children fidgeted. Augustus Jr. was pale, his fists clenched on the bench, his knuckles white. Catherine had tears in her eyes but refused to speak, and Meg sat quietly, her lips pressed tightly together, betraying none of the emotions roiling inside her. Across the room, Celia Rousseau Fairmont entered with Daniel and Ruth, now both dressed in the modest but carefully maintained attire befitting children of their father's acknowledgement. Celia's expression was calm, almost serene, as she moved with a quiet confidence that startled some and angered others. She had the air of someone who had known struggle but refused to let it define her. The whispers around the courtroom rose to a low hum, but no one dared interrupt. The presiding judge, a stern man with a lined face and a voice that carried authority even without speaking, called the room to order. Proceedings began with the formal reading of the will once more. Prescott stood beside Celia, carefully articulating each provision, emphasizing the legal basis for every clause. Every word seemed to ripple through the room like a shockwave. The acknowledgement of Daniel and Ruth as Augustus Fairmont's children was particularly incendiary. Those present understood the implications. Immediately, in a city built on rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules, the public recognition of children born to a woman of color who had formerly been property was almost revolutionary. The murmurs rose again, and some shook their heads in disbelief. Margaret's legal team objected immediately, citing South Carolina law and customary practice. They argued that a woman of color could not legally inherit real property, that enslaved children could not suddenly be granted freedom and ownership, and that the will violated every principle of Southern jurisprudence. They demanded the court declare the document invalid. Prescott responded calmly, outlining the measures Colonel Fairmont had taken to ensure the will's legality. Trusts had been established, witnesses had been properly documented, and every clause was written to survive scrutiny. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. He knew the forces arrayed against him were powerful and determined. Celia spoke next, her voice clear and unwavering. She addressed the court not with anger but with a dignity that made many pause. She spoke of Augustus Fairmont's intentions, of the injustice her children had endured, of the years of secrecy, fear, and silent suffering. She asked only for what had been legally promised: her freedom, her children's freedom, and the inheritance Colonel Fairmont had willed to them. The courtroom erupted into whispers again. Some observers were shocked by her eloquence, by her intelligence, by her confidence. Others were furious that someone so recently enslaved dared to speak in such a manner, to demand recognition and justice in a city that had never allowed such a thing. Margaret Fairmont finally rose. Her voice, cold and precise, cut through the murmurs. She spoke not as a woman pleading for her children but as a representative of Charleston's social order. She questioned the legitimacy of the document, the credibility of the witnesses, and the propriety of recognizing children born into slavery as rightful heirs. Her words were measured, her expression unreadable, but behind her calm lay a barely contained fury that the room could feel like electricity in the air. For several hours, arguments went back and forth. Legal precedents were cited, challenged, and reinterpreted. Prescott and Margaret's team sparred over every technicality, every word, every phrase. Celia and her children remained quiet for most of it, their presence a silent but powerful statement of resilience. Outside the courtroom, Charleston society reacted in kind. Letters appeared in newspapers, some sympathetic, some scandalized. Social clubs debated in hushed tones, questioning the meaning of fairness, race, and inheritance. Families who had maintained secrecy for generations began to whisper more openly about their own arrangements. The Fairmont case was no longer a private matter, it had become a lens through which the entire city examined itself. By the third day of the trial, tensions reached a breaking point. Arguments over property, legality, and morality gave way to deeper questions about humanity and power. Some younger lawyers began questioning the very foundation of the social order, arguing that fairness and law should apply equally, regardless of race or past condition. Their voices were tentative but present, hinting at the seismic changes that would come decades later. Celia remained composed, though her eyes betrayed moments of exhaustion. Daniel and Ruth clung to her hand when the arguments became heated, but they, too, carried themselves with the confidence of those who had been promised justice and were prepared to fight for it. The contrast between the calm determination of the Rousseau-Fairmont family and the increasingly frantic efforts of Margaret's team made the courtroom feel like a stage, each participant playing their part in a drama that was both legal and profoundly human. The judge, sensing the extraordinary nature of the case, called for a recess. As spectators poured into the streets, the news spread like wildfire. Everyone in Charleston knew the story: the will, the children, the audacious claim of property by a woman who had once been property herself. Conversations hummed with disbelief, outrage, curiosity, and even admiration. Inside the courthouse, Prescott reviewed his notes, aware that the days ahead would test not only the law but the very foundations of the society he had lived in his entire life. Celia quietly ensured her children were fed and rested, aware that the stakes were enormous. Margaret, in her private chambers, met with her lawyers in urgent consultation, plotting every possible route to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. By the end of the day, no final judgments had been made, but it was clear to everyone present that history was being written. What happened next would not only determine the fate of the Fairmont estate but also expose the hidden structures, hypocrisies, and injustices that had long governed Charleston's high society. The events set in motion by Augustus Fairmont's will had opened a door that could never be closed, and the consequences, both legal and moral, would echo for generations. And in the shadows of the courtroom, unseen by most, whispers began about what other secrets the city held, what other families had maintained appearances while hiding truths that could shatter lives. Charleston, it seemed, would never be the same again. If you want, I can continue with Part 9 next, keeping the tension higher and moving the story toward courtroom confrontations and darker family secrets. Do you want me to continue with Part 9? Here's Part 9 of your historic horror story, modified for an American YouTube audience, about 1,000 words, in simple and easy English, without dashes. The courtroom was quiet the next morning, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any words could describe. Outside, Charleston buzzed with speculation. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, carrying merchants, lawyers, and curious citizens eager to learn more about the Fairmont estate. Street corners were crowded with people debating the audacity of Colonel Augustus Fairmont's last will. Some condemned him as reckless, others whispered admiration at his courage to act honestly. Inside, proceedings resumed with a new intensity. Margaret Fairmont's legal team had refined their arguments overnight. They sought to undermine the very foundation of the will. They argued that a woman of color could not legally hold property of such magnitude, that Daniel and Ruth's status as former slaves barred them from inheritance, and that the witnesses, especially those who had been enslaved, lacked credibility. Their voices were sharp, practiced, and relentless. Prescott rose to counter, his presence calm yet firm. He laid out the careful legal measures Colonel Fairmont had taken to protect the will from challenge. Trusts had been established, technical language meticulously chosen to survive scrutiny, and every witness had signed under oath. He emphasized that Fairmont had acted knowingly, deliberately, and with the express purpose of correcting an injustice that had haunted him for years. Celia sat quietly beside Prescott, her hands folded. Daniel and Ruth flanked her, their eyes wide but steady. They listened to the arguments with an understanding beyond their years. They had been raised with the knowledge of their father's intentions, and they carried themselves with a dignity that surprised even seasoned observers. It was clear that they were no longer just children, they were the living embodiments of Fairmont's final act of defiance against the world that had tried to deny them existence. Margaret Fairmont rose again. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She spoke with a measured tone that hid her fury, but her words carried the venom of a woman who felt her life had been stolen. She painted a picture of betrayal, of the moral and social chaos that would result if the will were upheld. She questioned Celia directly, demanding to know how she had convinced Augustus to abandon his legitimate family. Celia's response was calm, almost serene. She reminded Margaret that it was not persuasion that had guided Augustus, but conscience. He had seen the injustice all around him and had acted before it was too late. The judge listened without interruption, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the attention he paid to every word. The proceedings stretched into hours, punctuated by heated exchanges between attorneys, moments of tense silence, and the occasional gasp from spectators as arguments became more personal and emotional. The most shocking moments came when witnesses were called to testify. Former overseers, house staff, and neighbors spoke reluctantly, their voices trembling as they recounted what they had seen over the years at Riverside Plantation. Some admitted they had known about Celia's special position, about the children, about the quiet acknowledgement of Daniel and Ruth as Fairmont's own. Others swore they had never known anything, their denials often less convincing than they intended. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. One witness, an elderly housekeeper who had served the Fairmont family for decades, spoke quietly but with authority. She described the respect Augustus had shown Celia, the way he had included her in decisions, the subtle acts that had elevated her beyond the status assigned by society. She described the fear and sorrow of Daniel and Ruth, and the courage they had shown in simply existing, quietly asserting their rightful place in the world. The courtroom was silent when she finished, as though the weight of her testimony had pressed down on every soul present. Margaret's children listened in disbelief, their shock slowly turning to anger and fear. Augustus Jr. clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked. Catherine, pale and trembling, could barely catch her breath. Meg sat stiffly, her eyes wide, absorbing every word. They had known their father had secrets, but the reality of the will, the legal recognition of Daniel and Ruth, was beyond their worst imaginings. Outside, the crowd grew restless. The story had reached nearly every corner of Charleston. Conversations in salons and on street corners speculated not just about the Fairmont case but about the larger implications. What did it mean for other families? How many children lived in the shadows, unacknowledged but rightful heirs? The city felt as though it teetered on the edge of a revelation that could shatter decades of carefully maintained appearances. Back in the courtroom, Prescott presented the final evidence, letters and notes written by Augustus Fairmont, documenting his intentions, his reasoning, and his knowledge of the law. Each letter emphasized his awareness of the consequences, his desire to act before death, and his determination to protect those who had been wronged by the society he had lived in. The documents were meticulous, clear, and undeniable. They left little room for argument. Celia spoke once more, her voice steady. She thanked the court for hearing the truth, for recognizing the humanity of her children, and for respecting the wishes of a man who had finally chosen integrity over convention. She did not gloat, she did not boast. She simply stated the facts, leaving the judgment to the law and to those who would decide the outcome. Margaret rose again, her expression a mask of control. She delivered a closing argument that was precise, biting, and carefully measured. She painted a picture of loss, of betrayal, and of the upheaval that would follow if the will were upheld. Yet even as she spoke, there was an undercurrent of unease in her voice. The more she denounced the fairness of the arrangement, the more undeniable the truth of Augustus Fairmont's intentions became. When she finished, the courtroom waited. The judge called for deliberation. Lawyers consulted quietly, spectators whispered among themselves, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The city outside held its collective breath. For the first time, many people realized that this case was not merely about property or inheritance. It was about justice, about recognition, about the possibility that even in a society built on oppression, someone could act with courage, and that their actions could ripple through history. As the judge finally prepared to deliver his initial guidance, there was a hush in the room. Everyone present understood that the decision would set a precedent. It would challenge the assumptions of Charleston society, disrupt the hierarchy, and perhaps ignite debates that could not be contained within the walls of the courthouse. The weight of history pressed down on every person present. The children of both families, the attorneys, the witnesses, even the silent spectators, felt it. Charleston itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether truth and justice could prevail against tradition and prejudice, whether the final words of a dying man could alter the course of lives and society alike. The case of Colonel Augustus Fairmont had become more than a matter of law. It had become a reckoning. If you want, I can continue with Part 10, the final part, where the judgment, the fallout, and the long-term consequences of Augustus Fairmont's will unfold dramatically. Do you want me to write Part 10 next? Here's Part 10, the final part of your historic horror story, around 1,000 words, written for an American YouTube audience in simple English, without dashes, and includes a call to action. The courtroom was tense the morning the judge returned with his decision. Months of testimony, arguments, and whispered speculation had culminated in this moment. Outside, Charleston seemed to hold its breath. Citizens lined the streets, eager for news of the Fairmont estate and the extraordinary turn of events that had captivated the city. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Margaret Fairmont sat with her children, her posture rigid, her face a mask of composure. Augustus Jr. looked pale and restless, Catherine clutched a handkerchief in her hands, and Meg sat silently, her thoughts unreadable. On the other side of the room, Celia Rousseau Fairmont sat with Daniel and Ruth, their eyes calm and steady. They had come prepared, not only with attorneys but with the knowledge that Augustus Fairmont had acted with deliberate care and foresight. The judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor, and took his seat. He looked at the assembled parties, his expression grave. He cleared his throat, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock somewhere in the back. After a long pause, he began. I have reviewed the entirety of the evidence presented, including the testimony of witnesses, the letters and documents submitted by counsel, and the provisions of the last will and testament of Colonel Augustus Fairmont. The court recognizes that the legal challenges raised by Mrs. Fairmont and her representatives are significant, given the prevailing statutes regarding property ownership and inheritance in the state of South Carolina. He paused, scanning the room. However, the court also recognizes the deliberate and meticulous measures taken by Colonel Fairmont to ensure that his intentions could withstand legal scrutiny. Trusts have been established, witnesses verified, and technical language employed to account for the extraordinary circumstances of this case. Margaret Fairmont shifted slightly, her hand tightening around her gloves. Celia's posture remained calm, but her eyes followed every movement of the judge. It is the opinion of this court that Colonel Fairmont acted with full knowledge of the law and with clear intention to provide for Celia Rousseau Fairmont and her children, Daniel and Ruth. The bequests outlined in the will, while extraordinary and challenging to established custom, are legally binding. Celia Rousseau Fairmont is hereby recognized as the sole owner of Riverside Plantation, the Charleston townhouse at Trad Street, the business interests of Fairmont and Lazarus Cotton Factors, and all associated personal and financial assets as detailed in the will. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Augustus Jr. clenched his jaw. Margaret Fairmont sat rigid, her expression unreadable. Catherine and Meg exchanged worried glances. Daniel's lips curved slightly, a small but genuine expression of relief, while Ruth reached up to touch her mother's hand. Regarding the dower rights of Mrs. Fairmont, the court finds that she is entitled to her one-third portion of the real estate for her lifetime, but that such rights shall not interfere with the management or ownership rights of Celia Rousseau Fairmont. This court further acknowledges the legal status of Daniel and Ruth as the natural children of Augustus Fairmont and directs that they be raised free, with all rights and privileges afforded to them under law. Margaret's face had hardened into a mask of fury and disbelief. Augustus Jr. slammed his hand lightly on the table, his expression one of pure outrage. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, while Meg remained silent but tense. Celia's gaze did not waver. She understood the gravity of the moment, but she also understood the victory it represented. For her children, and for the legacy of Augustus Fairmont, this was a moment of justice long delayed. The courtroom would not forget the reactions that followed. Some spectators gasped audibly, others whispered in awe. Lawyers from both sides shifted uncomfortably. For many, it was impossible to comprehend how a woman who had once been legally enslaved could now control an estate of immense value, manage a business, and dictate the future of a prominent Charleston family. Yet the law, carefully navigated and prepared, had recognized the truth of Colonel Fairmont's final wishes. Margaret Fairmont stood and left the room without a word, her children following. Augustus Jr. muttered something under his breath, but the words were lost amid the commotion. Outside, they climbed into a waiting carriage, their faces pale with the shock and anger that would follow them for years. Celia, Daniel, and Ruth stepped into the sunlight for the first time as recognized heirs. Journalists and curious onlookers crowded the steps of the courthouse, eager to witness this extraordinary moment. Celia held Daniel's hand and Ruth's hand firmly, a quiet gesture of protection and pride. For the first time, they were no longer hidden, no longer property, no longer bound by the shadows of Charleston society. They were free, recognized, and empowered. In the days that followed, the Fairmont case became legend. Newspapers carried detailed accounts, some praising Colonel Fairmont's courage and foresight, others condemning the disruption of social order. Families across Charleston whispered about the implications of the ruling. The city, long built on the carefully maintained separation of races and the invisibility of certain truths, had been forced to confront the reality that power, conscience, and justice could collide in ways that no one could ignore. For Celia and her children, the victory was bittersweet. They inherited wealth, property, and social standing, but the cost of recognition had been immense. The memory of years spent in bondage, the awareness of what had been stolen from them, and the knowledge of the anger they would face from the Fairmont family and society at large lingered like shadows. Yet in those shadows, they found strength. Augustus Fairmont's final act had given them the chance to live not just freely, but with dignity and purpose. Riverside Plantation was restored under Celia's direction. Daniel learned the management of the estate, preparing to continue his father's legacy in a manner that combined discipline, compassion, and intelligence. Ruth excelled in reading and writing, her education no longer limited by circumstance. They became a family recognized not only for wealth but for resilience and courage. In the years that followed, the Fairmont case remained a cautionary tale and a story of rare justice. Charleston continued to grapple with its own history, its complicity in systemic oppression, and the ways in which truth, once revealed, could not be contained. The story of Colonel Augustus Fairmont, Celia Rousseau Fairmont, and their children became one of whispered legend, taught quietly in some circles, remembered in others as a shock to the genteel order. Celia often walked the halls of the Charleston townhouse, thinking of the man who had chosen honesty over comfort, integrity over convenience. She remembered his final words, "Tell them the truth, all of it." She had done that, and in doing so, had rewritten history in a way that no law, prejudice, or social custom could erase. The legacy of the Fairmont estate, the freedom of Daniel and Ruth, and the courage of a man who refused to remain silent would be remembered for generations. It was a story of horror and injustice, yes, but also one of justice, courage, and the radical power of truth. If you found this story as chilling and captivating as we hoped, make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and share this story with friends. Comment below and tell us what part of Charleston history surprised you the most and where you are listening from. Join the Liturgy of Fear community and explore the dark corners of American history with us.